The building had no name on its front door. It did not need one. Everyone in the city of Atlanta, Georgia, knew what the tall glass tower on Peachtree Grand Boulevard was. They knew who owned it. They knew what happened inside its upper floors. And on the rare days when those floors were opened to outside visitors, people dressed their very best, spoke their very softest, and moved with the careful steps of those who understood without being told that this place belonged to someone far more powerful than themselves. It was a Tuesday morning in late October when the boy named Marcus first walked through those front doors. He had not dressed his best. He wore the same gray school shirt he wore every Tuesday, freshly washed by his mother the night before and hung on the back of a wooden chair to dry. His shoes were black, worn thin at the toe, the laces replaced twice already with different colored ones because the original laces kept snapping. His backpack was old and faded, the left strap held together with a safety pin his grandmother had pressed into it the year before she passed away. He carried the bag over his right shoulder only. He should not have been in that building at all. His mother, a woman named Diane Carter, had come to clean the upper floors. The building called her in on special occasions when the regular crew was considered not careful enough or not quiet enough for certain rooms. Diane was neither of those things. She was the most careful woman Marcus had ever known in his life, and the quietest. She had been cleaning offices in that tower for 11 years, always before sunrise or sometimes after midnight. She knew which elevator required a special key card. She knew which hallways smelled of lemon polish and which smelled of old carpet and age. She knew the building the way a person knows a place they have inhabited in darkness for years. She knew it better than most of the people who worked there every day, even though not one of those people truly saw her when she passed them in the hall. Today, she had brought Marcus along because his school had a half day for teacher training and she had no one she could leave him with. She told him to sit in the small break room near the service elevator on the 43rd floor. She told him not to touch anything. She told him not to wander. Marcus was 12 years old. He listened to his mother in most things, but listening to her did not mean he stopped noticing the world around him. And what he noticed, sitting quietly in that break room with a library book open across his knees, was the sound of voices changing in the hallway beyond the wall. Voices in buildings like this always carried a certain tone, firm, fast, certain of themselves, the sound of people who were paid to sound like they knew exactly what they were doing at all times. But the voices he heard now were different. They were fast in a different way, not the fast of confidence, the fast of worry wearing the costume of confidence. He had learned to hear the difference from his grandmother, who had always said that the most important information a person ever gave you was what they were trying hardest not to say. He set his book down. He listened more carefully. He heard a woman in pain, and around that pain he heard an entire room of people working very hard to pretend they did not. Her full name was Margaret Eloise Whitfield, and she was 74 years old, though she rarely told anyone that. She had built her first company at 22 from a rented desk in a shared office in downtown Atlanta with $200, a borrowed filing cabinet, and a secondhand telephone. By 30, that company had grown into 3. By 45, those 3 had absorbed 17 others. By 60, she had become the kind of wealthy that stopped being measured in millions and started being measured in something larger and vaguer and more difficult to comprehend. People called her a trillionaire in whispers, not to her face. No one said very much to her face, except yes and of course and right away. She had earned that particular silence around her the way a mountain earns the silence of the valley below it. Not through cruelty exactly, through presence, through the simple and overwhelming fact of being so large, so permanent, and so far above ordinary concerns that everyone around her simply adjusted their behavior accordingly and called the adjustment respect. She was not a tall woman. She was small and thin, with white hair always pinned back tightly, and hands that looked too delicate for everything they had signed and built. She wore the same style of dark navy suit nearly every day, different fabrics for different seasons, but always that deep, serious blue. She wore one piece of jewelry, a thin gold bracelet on her left wrist that had belonged to her own mother, who died when Margaret was 9 years old. She never took the bracelet off. She never explained it to anyone who asked. She had been in that building every working day for 31 years. She had sat in every boardroom on every floor. She had signed papers that moved the prices of things that ordinary people bought without knowing her name. She had made decisions that sent ripples through economies she never visited. She was, by every measure that the modern world had invented for such purposes, one of the most powerful human beings alive on the planet. And, for 3 weeks, she had been in serious pain. It had begun as a tightness just below the right shoulder, a dull and persistent pressure that arrived and departed without warning. She had ignored it the way she ignored all discomfort. Discomfort was something you moved through, the way you moved through difficult weather or difficult negotiations. You kept going. You did not stop. But the tightness grew. It moved along her arm, reaching her elbow, reaching her hand. It climbed the side of her neck. It woke her at night sometimes, sharp and insistent, refusing to be talked away by the usual internal arguments she deployed against inconvenient physical complaints. She had eventually allowed her personal doctor, a careful man named Dr. Fenton, to run tests. He had run many of them. He had brought in 3 specialists, then a 4th. None of them had told her anything clear. They spoke around the edges of the problem with the careful language of people who were afraid of being wrong in front of someone very important. This morning, the pain had been worse than it had been in days, but she had a meeting. She always had a meeting, and Margaret Whitfield did not cancel meetings. By the time she entered the 43rd floor conference room, the one with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the whole spread of the city, the one where the chairs alone cost more than most people earned in a month, the pain had settled into a deep, grinding ache that rode the length of her arm like something that moved in and decided to stay. She sat at the head of the table. She kept her face still. She opened the meeting. There were 14 people in that room. 6 were her own executives. 3 were visiting investors from overseas, large men in expensive coats who laughed among themselves with the easy comfort of people who had never needed anyone's approval. 2 were lawyers. 1 was a technology consultant who had been flown in from San Francisco the previous evening. 1 was a personal assistant named Priya who took notes on a slim tablet without looking at the screen. And 1 was Dr. Fenton, who had been asked to attend because Priya, in 8 years of service, had never been right about what was necessary. The numbers on the wall screens were doing well. Numbers in this room always did well. People made sure of it. She listened to reports. She asked 2 questions. She approved 1 proposal and deferred another. She did all of this while the pain in her arm grew louder in the way a sound grows louder when the room around it gets quieter. It was Priya who noticed the change in her breathing first, then Dr. Fenton, then one by one, as will happen in a room full of people watching someone very carefully, the others. She set down her pen. She sat very still. The pain had moved again, up, sharper now, pressing with a hot weight just below her collarbone. Her right hand had begun, almost imperceptibly, to tremble. The room froze. 14 very accomplished people looked at her with the specific, helpless expression of those who are excellent at their jobs and completely useless in this moment. Someone called for an ambulance. The paramedics arrived in 11 minutes. They were professional and quick. They checked her, ran a portable monitor, spoke to Fenton in low tones. They recommended she go to a proper facility. She said, quietly and absolutely finally, that she was not going anywhere. The meeting would continue. She would stay in her seat. Dr. Fenton would remain beside her. Everyone else would please return their attention to the agenda. The paramedics looked at each other. Then they looked at the room. They left their equipment and their phone number. They left. The pain stayed. And then one of the overseas investors, the broadest of the three, a man who laughed too loudly and too often at his own observations, decided that the taut silence called for a light touch. He cleared his throat and spoke with a smile he probably thought was charming. He said that where he came from, they had traditional healers who charged a great deal of money. Maybe they should find one. Heal her for $10 million, yes? He laughed. The sound filled the room and bounced back off the glass. Mrs. Whitfield looked at him steadily. Then, because pain sometimes discovers its own sharp humor, and because she had always used sharpness as armor, she said something she would turn over in her mind for the rest of her life. She said, $10 million. If someone could truly do it, I would pay $10 million without a moment's hesitation. The room smiled with her. Carefully, the way people smile around the very powerful, just enough to show they understood the tone, not enough to suggest they were not taking the situation seriously. No one expected what happened next.
Marcus had not meant to be standing in the doorway of the conference room. He had needed a bathroom, and his mother had told him it was down the hall and to the left, and he had turned right by mistake. He sometimes turned the wrong way when he was thinking about something else, and he had been thinking about something else. He had been reading a library book about traditional healing practices from West Africa, a book his school librarian, Mrs. Okafor, had set aside for him the previous month because she knew the kinds of things he was interested in. He had been reading about pressure points and the way certain healers understood the body not as a collection of separate parts, but as a single connected system of rivers and channels, each one affecting every other. He had been thinking about how similar that description was to the things his grandmother used to say to him when he was small. So he had turned right instead of left, and he had ended up at an open doorway. And through that doorway, he could see a large, bright room full of well-dressed people, all very carefully not looking at a small, thin, old woman in a dark navy suit who sat very straight in her chair with one hand pressed flat on the table and a trembling she could not quite control running through her right arm. He stopped. He watched for a moment, not out of nosiness, but out of the same careful instinct his grandmother had trained into him over years of patient teaching. She had always said, before you do anything at all, observe. Let the eyes do their work before the hands do theirs. The eyes collect information that the mind has not yet organized. Give them time. What Marcus observed in those first few seconds was this. The woman's pain lived in her shoulder and arm, but its origin was higher. He could see it in the way she held her neck, the right side carrying more tension than the left, tilted very slightly as if bracing against something. He could see it in the way her right collarbone sat, pulled upward by something tightening below it. He recognized the pattern, the way you recognize a song you have heard before in a different room. He had seen it once before in a neighbor named Mr. Calloway, and he remembered exactly what his grandmother had done about it and exactly what happened when she did. He stood in the doorway while the investor made his joke about healers and $10 million. He heard the old woman say she would pay it, and something moved in him that was not ambition and was not greed and was not anything that had a clean modern name. It was older than any of those things.
It was the thing his grandmother had tried to describe to him once, the pull you feel when your hands know something that can help and the person who needs the help is standing right in front of you. He thought of his grandmother. He stepped into the room.
No one noticed him at first, or rather, no one chose to notice him, which is a different thing entirely from not being noticed. The room was full of people whose eyes worked perfectly well, but rooms like this one, filled with people like these people, develop habits of seeing and habits of not seeing, and those habits run deep and quiet as rivers beneath frozen ground. They protect the room from having to deal with what does not fit the room's idea of itself. Marcus was small for 12. He wore a school shirt. His shoes were old. He was a black boy in a room that was not used to black boys, or boys of any kind, or anyone who had arrived in this building through the service entrance. Every one of these facts told the room's automatic habits which direction to look, which was not toward him. But he walked in anyway, slowly, without rushing or pushing, without making himself loud or dramatic, or anything other than simply present. His grandmother had told him once that the way you enter a room tells the room more than you realize. She had said that the people who enter with force are usually the people who are afraid the room will not let them in. The people who enter quietly are usually the people who already know they belong there, even when the room has not yet understood this. His mother appeared in the hallway behind him. The color had drained from her face. She had heard the change in the sounds from the conference room and had come out of the office she was cleaning, and now she saw her son walking calmly toward the most important room on the floor. She opened her mouth to call to him. Something made her stop. It was the look on his face. She had seen that look before on exactly one other person in her lifetime. It was the look her mother got. The look of absolute certainty that was not arrogance, not performance, not the desperate push of someone hoping they were right, simply the settled knowing of someone who had already seen the situation clearly and had already made the decision that followed from seeing it clearly. She stood in the hallway and held her cloth bag with both hands, and she did not call him back. Inside the room, people were beginning to register the boy's presence. The process moved slowly across the room like a wave. Priya first, looking up from her tablet with a frown. Then one of the lawyers, whose eyes narrowed. Then the investor who had made the joke, who tilted his head with the confused expression of a man trying to work out where this child had come from and what he imagined he was doing. Mrs. Whitfield saw him last. She turned her head with the careful slowness she had adopted when the pain was at its peak, and she looked at the boy standing in the middle of her conference room. The security guard near the far wall took a step forward. Mrs. Whitfield raised one finger. The guard stopped. She studied the boy with the sharp, pale eyes that had spent 74 years reading situations and people. She looked at his shoes. She looked at the safety pin on his backpack strap. She looked at his face. What she expected to find was the ordinary boldness of a child who had wandered somewhere he should not be, half embarrassed and half daring. What she actually found was something that gave her a small and involuntary pause. He was not looking at her face. He was looking at her arm, with an expression of focused attention she had seen on exactly one other person in her lifetime. The lead surgeon who operated on her husband's spine 17 years ago. That man looked at the MRI scans the way this child was looking at her arm, the face of someone doing something they understood completely. She almost smiled. Instead, because the pain chose that exact moment to rise sharply through her shoulder and she needed to disguise the breath it stole from her, she turned the almost smile into something harder. She said, with the practiced authority of a woman who had never walked into a room she could not immediately own, "Well, what have we here? Did someone call for a house visit?" The laughter.
Careful laughter, following a cue. $10 million, was it? She continued, louder now, performing for the audience around her. Is that your rate, young man? Shall I have my assistant write you a check? More laughter. The overseas investor laughed hardest. Even Dr. Fenton managed a tight smile, though his eyes kept moving back to the monitor readings. The boy did not laugh. He did not look embarrassed or stung or uncertain. He looked the way his grandmother had always looked when people tried to make her small before she had a chance to help them. She had been made small many times in her life. She was a poor black woman who healed people with her knowledge and her hands, and the world had any number of names for that, very few of them kind. She had heard every one of those names. She looked back at the people who said them with the same patient, untroubled expression that her grandson now wore in this glass tower 43 floors above the street. Power does not shout, she had always told him. It waits. He waited. The laughter faded. The room settled back into its uncomfortable silence. The pain returned to Mrs. Whitfield's arm, and she pressed her hand flat against the table again, a reflex she immediately regretted because it let them see. The boy took one step forward. He said, "My name is Marcus. I think I might be able to help you." His voice was soft. It carried clearly in the quiet room.
Her name was Rose Evelyn Carter. She had lived her entire life in a neighborhood called Vine Hill, in a small house at the end of Delmar Street where the sidewalk cracked along old roots, and the oak tree in the front yard had been there since before anyone currently living could remember. She was Marcus's grandmother on his mother's side, and she was the most quietly extraordinary person he had ever known or would ever know. She had not been educated in any formal sense. She had left school at 15 to help care for her own mother, who was sick, and she had never gone back. She had spent her 20s working in a laundry, her 30s cleaning houses, her 40s doing both while raising 3 children largely by herself after her husband was injured on a construction job and never recovered enough to work again. She had learned what she knew about the human body from a woman in her neighborhood who was the daughter of a woman, who was the granddaughter of a woman whose knowledge stretched back further than any written record in this country could follow. She learned by watching. She learned by doing. She learned by being present in rooms where illness lived and paying attention to everything she could perceive, the way a person held their body, the quality of their breathing, the texture and temperature of their skin, the particular kind of tension that lived in different muscles depending on what was wrong and how long it had been wrong. She kept notes in small spiral notebooks that she bought 3 at a time from the dollar store. Those notebooks contained careful observations, patterns she had identified, connections she had drawn between things that the medical world had not always thought to connect. She did not call herself a healer. The word embarrassed her. She said she was someone who listened carefully and helped when she could. She said the body wanted to be well and moved naturally toward wellness when you stopped fighting it and started working with it. She said most of what she did was help people get out of their own body's way. She began teaching Marcus when he was 5, not with formal lessons, not with textbooks. She taught him the way her own teacher had taught her, by including him, by letting him sit nearby when she worked with someone, by narrating what she noticed in quiet, simple words, by asking him afterward what he had observed and praising him when he had caught something real and gently redirecting him when he had missed something important. "Feel this," she would say, placing his small fingers against the inside of a wrist. "Count the heartbeats. Now feel again. Is it the same as before? Is it smoother or rougher? Look here," she would say, pressing her thumb gently alongside the muscles near someone's spine. "Do you see how this side is harder than the other? What might that be telling us?"
She taught him to think of the body as a conversation in which every part was always responding to every other part. She taught him about the cluster of muscles along the side of the neck, the ones she called the scalenes, and how those muscles, when they contracted too tightly and held that contraction over months or years, could press against a bundle of nerves and blood vessels that ran down the arm. She showed him how that pressure could send pain and numbness all the way to the hand, could make the arm feel heavy and hot and wrong in ways that had nothing to do with the arm itself and everything to do with the neck. She showed him on Mr. Calloway, the neighbor who had spent months believing something was wrong with his heart. After Rose released what was holding, Mr. Calloway sat quietly for a moment with a dazed look on his face, and then said he had not felt like himself in so long he had forgotten what himself felt like. "Remember that," Rose told Marcus afterward. "That face. That is the face of a body remembering itself. That is what we are helping people find their way back to." She died on a Wednesday morning in February, 2 years before Marcus walked into the 43rd floor conference room. She had gone to sleep the night before, saying goodnight to her mother in the kitchen, feeling tired the way she usually did at the end of long weeks. She had not woken up. The doctors said her heart had simply stopped in the night, quietly, without struggle. My mother said that sounded exactly like her. She had always done everything quietly. She would have wanted to leave quietly, too. Marcus cried for 3 days. Then he picked up one of her spiral notebooks from the box where she kept them, and he started reading. He read all 15 of them. Then he started over. He now carried the worn blue one in his backpack, always, the one with the most notes in it, the one where she had written in the margin beside a passage about neck muscles and arm pain, "Show Marcus this when he is ready." He believed he was ready. He had believed it for a while.
Mrs. Whitfield studied the boy for a long moment after he said those words. She was a woman who had learned to read people within the first minutes of encountering them, a skill she had honed over decades of negotiations and hirings and transactions and conversations where enormous sums moved on the basis of whether she trusted the person across the table. She had used this skill so many times and in so many settings that it had become simply the way she saw. She looked at Marcus now with that skill fully engaged. He was a child. He was poor. He had no business being in this room. He had no credentials and no equipment and no institutional backing and no reason whatsoever to be standing at the head of her conference table on a Tuesday morning in October. All of this was true. Also true, she thought, he was not afraid. He was not performing confidence, that thin, tight confidence assembled from rehearsed language and expensive tailoring. He was simply present, grounded in himself in a way she had rarely encountered, even in much older people, even in powerful people, even in people who had every reason in the world to feel certain of themselves and usually let that certainty be known. And he was still looking at her arm, with that surgeon's attention. Dr. Fenton cleared his throat. He had the expression of a man about to say something professionally necessary that he would strongly prefer not to have to say. "Mrs. Whitfield, I really do think we ought to," she said without looking at him. "Fenton, in 23 years, have I ever asked for your assessment when I did not ask for it?" A pause. "No, ma'am. Then please continue being quiet." She returned her attention to the boy. He had not moved during this exchange. He had not smiled at her small demonstration of authority or seemed either entertained or unsettled by it. He simply waited with the natural patience of someone who understood that waiting was not the same as doing nothing. It was something. Sometimes it was the most important thing. "How old are you?" she asked. 12, he said. "And what makes you believe you can help me? What do you know that 4 medical specialists apparently do not?" He thought carefully before answering. She noticed this.
He took the question seriously rather than rushing past it toward his answer. He looked briefly at the floor, then returned his gaze to her. "I do not know everything they know, but I think I can see something that might be the source of your pain. My grandmother showed me. She helped a lot of people with this kind of problem." "Your grandmother?" "Yes, ma'am." "A doctor?" "No, ma'am, but she understood how the body works. She kept very detailed notes." He shifted the backpack slightly on his shoulder. "I have been reading them." From somewhere behind him, one of the overseas investors made a sound between a cough and a laugh. Someone else shifted in their chair. The lawyer nearest the window arranged her face into careful professional neutrality and worked hard to keep it there. Mrs. Whitfield ignored all of them. She kept her eyes on Marcus. She asked one more question. "What do you think you see?" He told her, clearly, calmly, in simple language. He described the muscles along the side of the neck and what happens to the nerves below them when those muscles contract and hold that contraction for a long time. He described where that nerve bundle ran and how the pressure on it sent pain down the arm. He pointed carefully, without touching her, to the side of his own neck to show her where he meant. Dr. Fenton made a small sound, not quite a laugh, something more complicated, the sound of a professional processing information that did not fit neatly into any category he had prepared. Mrs. Whitfield was very still for a moment. Then she said, "I was in a car accident 19 years ago. They called it whiplash, the right side. They told me it healed." "Sometimes old injuries leave tightness behind that never fully releases," Marcus said. "My grandmother called it the body holding its memory." The room was extremely quiet. Mrs. Whitfield looked at her arm. She looked at the boy. She looked at the room around her, at the careful, nervous, helpless faces of 14 very accomplished people who had between them all not been able to do what this 12-year-old just did, which was simply see her. She said one word, "All right."
The room rearranged itself around what was about to happen. People shifted chairs. People stepped back. The security guard, after a long moment of looking at Mrs. Whitfield and receiving no instruction, moved to stand off to the side, present but out of the way, which was the best any of them could manage. Marcus set his backpack down carefully against the wall. He walked to where Mrs. Whitfield sat at the head of the table. He stopped about 3 feet from her and stood still, not touching her yet, just looking. His grandmother had taught him this, and he had never forgotten it. Never rush the looking. The hands follow the eyes. Get the eyes right first. He looked at the line of her shoulders. The right one sat slightly elevated, pulled toward her ear by the same fraction of tension that had probably lived there so long she had stopped feeling it as tension and simply felt it as herself. He looked at how her head sat on her neck, the compensation, the subtle lean her spine had developed over years to accommodate the holding on the right side. He looked at her collarbone, the right one higher, as his grandmother had shown him it would be, when the first rib had been slowly pulled upward by the chronic contraction of the muscle beside it. He saw it all clearly, the same map his grandmother had once drawn for him in words and practice. He said quietly, "May I?" and held out his open hand, palm upward, in front of her. She looked at that hand for a moment. It was a child's hand, small and brown, with rough patches at the palm. It held no instrument. It was connected to no machine. It came with no certificate and no institutional authority of any kind. She placed her wrist in his palm. The room seemed collectively to exhale. He placed 2 fingers on the inside of her wrist, not pressing, simply resting, the way his grandmother had taught him, light as a question. His eyes closed. He felt the pulse move under his fingertips, quick, slightly uneven, carrying the particular quality of a nervous system that had been managing chronic pain for a long time.
He felt the warmth of the skin, the right arm warmer than a resting arm should be, a sign of restricted circulation that Rose had always told him to look for. He held still. This was the part people watching always found the strangest, a person standing with closed eyes and 2 fingers on a wrist, apparently doing nothing. His grandmother used to say that this was when you were doing the most essential thing, which was building a map of the inside from what you could feel on the outside, listening through the skin. After about 15 seconds, he moved slowly and carefully. He shifted. He brought his other hand up and placed it gently against the right side of her neck, barely more than a resting touch, so light she could hardly feel it. He pressed his fingers along the muscle that ran down the side of her neck and found the place. It was there as clearly as he had known it would be, harder on the right than the left, contracted into itself, holding something it had been holding for 19 years because no one had ever asked it to let go. Not a dramatic knot, not a sudden injury, just a long, patient tightening that had never been released. He remembered his grandmother's voice. "You are not fighting the muscle. You are having a conversation with it. Your job is to tell it the emergency is over, that it is safe to release. You use your fingers to ask, not to force. Asking is stronger than forcing, always." He pressed with gentle, steady intention, not harder, just steadier. Held the contact the way you hold a question and wait for the answer to form at its own speed. Mrs. Whitfield's breath changed. It was subtle, you would have missed it if you were not watching closely, and everyone in the room was watching as closely as they had watched anything in a long time. Her breath slowed, deepened, became different. The breath of someone's body has just received news it has been waiting for. He moved his fingers slightly, not releasing but shifting, asking the next layer the same quiet question. He followed the path his grandmother had shown him, down the side of the neck, towards the attachment at the first rib, and then he brought his other hand to cup the top of her shoulder, not grabbing, just cradling, creating the gentlest possible downward ease. His grandmother had shown him that this alone sometimes released the whole holding, because the shoulder and the neck are in constant conversation with each other, and sometimes all the shoulder needs is to feel someone gently asking it downward, while the neck decides if it is safe to let go. 40 seconds, perhaps a little more. The trembling in Mrs. Whitfield's arm slowed. It slowed further. It stopped. She sat very still. She was staring at a point on the far wall with an expression that was neither pain nor calm, but something between the two, the expression of a person in the process of verifying whether something she does not quite believe has actually happened. Marcus removed his hands slowly. He stepped back. He stood where he had stood before, hands at his sides, his face quiet. The room waited. Mrs. Whitfield raised her right arm, slowly, carefully, with the deliberateness of someone performing an inventory. She raised it above the level of the table. She rotated it. She extended it to the side. She moved the shoulder backward and forward. She lowered the arm. She turned to look at Marcus. Her voice, when it came, was lower than it had been. The performance had left it. What remained was simply a voice. "What did you do?" she asked. He answered the way his grandmother had answered when people asked her the same question after something like this. "I listened, and then I helped your body remember how to let go of what it had been holding."
There are silences that are empty and silences that are full. The silence that settled over that room was the fullest kind. It was packed with every human reaction running at the same moment, shock and shame and wonder and disbelief, and something that had no single clean name but felt like the ground shifting beneath old certainties that had never expected to be tested. Dr. Fenton moved first, professional reflex overcoming everything else. He crossed to the portable monitor and looked at the readings. He looked at them again. His face moved through several expressions in rapid succession, none of which he managed to conceal. He swallowed hard. The readings were calm, not in the way of a system managing a difficult situation, genuinely calm. The erratic quality that had been running through the earlier numbers, the pattern he had been attributing to pain response and stress, was simply gone. The lines had settled into something even and clean and unhurried. He looked at the boy. He looked back at the monitor. He looked at the boy again with the expression of a man standing at the edge of a category he does not have a name for. Dr. Saran, the neurological specialist who had flown in the day before specifically to consult on the arm symptoms, walked over and studied the monitor for a long time without speaking. When she finally looked up, her expression carried something in addition to the shock that everyone else was showing. It was the look of a scientist whose model of the world has just become slightly larger than it was, and who is still deciding how to feel about that. The overseas investors were quiet. The one who had made the joke about $10 million was looking at his hands. One of the young lawyers had pressed her notepad against her chest without realizing she was doing it, as if she were protecting something or being protected. Priya was crying, silently without trying to hide it. She had worked for Mrs. Whitfield for 8 years and watched her move through the past 3 weeks of pain with a refusal to acknowledge it or show fear that had been, Priya now realized, one of the most exhausting things she had ever witnessed. She had felt helpless in the ordinary, terrible way of people who care about someone they cannot fix. She was not crying from sadness now. She was crying from the specific relief of watching something be repaired that she had been afraid might not be repairable. And from something else, something harder to name, a kind of gratitude directed at a 12-year-old in worn shoes who walked in from a service hallway and did what 8 medical professionals and the resources of significant wealth had not. Mrs. Whitfield herself had not moved from her chair. She did not stand up and declare anything. She sat at the head of her table with both hands resting in her lap, and she looked at Marcus, and she was, for the first time in a very long time, completely silent. Her executives would discuss this later, in quiet conversations they were careful to have when she was not nearby. Not the healing, not the boy, but her silence. They had never seen it before. Margaret Whitfield was not a person who allowed silence to happen inside her. She filled every silence with something, a question, an observation, a decision. The silence that lived in her now was the silence of someone who had encountered something too large and too true for words to be the right response. Marcus waited. He was comfortable in silence in the way of people who have grown up around it, who have learned that it is not absence but presence of a different kind. He was thinking about his grandmother, about the hundreds of people who had come to the small house on Delmar Street in the 11 years since he was born, had sat in her kitchen or her front room, had left walking differently than they arrived. The world had never called her grandmother extraordinary. The world had never called her anything except the name on her utility bills. She cleaned houses for money and helped her neighbors for nothing, and lived and died in a neighborhood the city only noticed when it wanted to build something that would displace it. And now her hands are in this room. Mrs. Whitfield spoke. "You healed me," she said. Marcus shook his head, a small movement. "No," he said, "your body healed. I only helped it find the path back." She looked at him. She nodded once, slowly. "What is your name?" she asked, though she had heard it before. She wanted to say it again, to give it proper weight. "Marcus Carter," he said. She repeated it quietly, as if committing it to memory in the place where she kept the things that mattered. She reached for her phone. The motion was so habitual that the screen was already unlocked and the banking application already open before she had fully decided what she was going to do. She looked at the boy. $10 million, she said. I meant what I said. Give me an account, your mother's name. I will transfer it now. It is just my mom, Marcus said. Your mother, then. Tell me her... "Please," he said. The word stopped her. Not the word itself, the way he said it. Quietly, without apology, without the flinching quality of someone asking a favor. Simply a genuine request. The request of someone who had thought about this already and already knew what he wanted to say. "Please," he said again, "we do not need the money for this." The room was so still that the sound of the city 43 floors below could be heard through the glass. She looked at him for a moment before she spoke. "Why not?" He thought carefully. She had noticed from the beginning that he did this, took time before answering, as if each question deserved the respect of a real answer rather than the first available words. She found herself respecting it more each time he did it. "My grandmother healed people her whole life and never charged anything for it," he said. "She said that healing is a duty, not a product, that if you take money for it, it becomes something different, something smaller." He paused. She believed that. Mrs. Whitfield looked at him for a long time. "She sounds like a remarkable woman," she said. "She was," he said. "She died 2 years ago." "I am sorry." "Thank you." A pause settled between them. Something in the quality of the silence shifted. It became more human, less like the silence of a professional situation, and more like the silence between two people who have discovered, unexpectedly, that they understand something about each other. "What do you want, then?" she asked. "You must want something. Everyone who does something this significant wants something in return." He thought again, this time longer. "I want to learn more," he said. "My grandmother's notebooks only go so far. There are books I cannot afford. There are people who know things she did not know, doctors and healers who have studied for a long time, and I do not know how to reach them. I want to keep learning, both kinds of learning, the kind from books and schools, and the kind from hands and practice." He looked at her steadily. "I think they need each other." She put her phone face down on the table. She looked at him with an expression that had come through something and arrived at the other side of it, clearer. "You want to study," she said. "Yes, ma'am." "To become a doctor?" He hesitated before answering. He said he was not sure yet what he wanted to become. He wanted to understand the body the way his grandmother had understood it, and also the way books and medical schools taught it. He believed both ways of knowing were true and important, and that they had been kept too far apart from each other for too long. He thought the separation had cost people. She was quiet for a long time after he said this. Then she said, "I think you may be right about that."
Diane Carter had not moved from the hallway during any of it. She had been standing outside the conference room door for what felt like a very long time, her cloth bag held in both hands, watching through the glass panel in the wall beside the doorframe. She could not hear everything through the glass, but she could see clearly enough. She had watched her son walk into the room. She had watched the old woman laugh. She had watched Marcus stand in the wave of that laughter without flinching, without retreating, without changing his face. She had watched him step forward. She had watched him work. She knew what she was watching when she saw it. She had grown up in rooms where her mother did this. She had absorbed, even without deliberately trying, the language of those moments, the quality of attention, the way a patient's breathing shifted, the specific before and after of it that was as recognizable to her as a language she had heard all her life without ever learning to speak it herself. She had been crying before it was finished, and she was still crying after. Silent tears she kept wiping with the edge of her cloth because she was Diane Carter, and she did not cry loudly, and she did not cry where people could see it, and she had learned this in the same place she had learned most things, which was from her mother. She was crying because of what her son had just done.
She was crying because of who had taught him to do it. She was crying because the woman who had taught him was not here to see it. And that was a particular grief. The grief not of forgetting, but of remembering too precisely what has been lost. She had not told Marcus everything his grandmother had hoped for him. There had been a conversation in the last year of Rose's life that Diane had kept close and private. Her mother had told her very quietly and very clearly that Marcus had something, the same something she had, the capacity to really see, the capacity to really hear. She had said, "He is going to do something with this. I do not know what it will be, but do not let the world take it from him before he figures it out." Diane held those words for 2 years. She worked nights so the bills stayed paid and Marcus could stay in school. She worked holidays so he could have books when he asked for them. She took the early morning and late night shifts so the days could belong to him. She did not explain these sacrifices. She made them the way her mother had made them and the way the women in her family had always made them, not expecting recognition, just expecting that it would be enough. She watched her son speak to one of the most powerful women in the country as if they were simply two people in a room having a necessary conversation, and she thought, it was enough. Whatever your grandmother saw in you, she was right. The door opened. Marcus came out. His eyes went to his mother's face immediately, the way they always did when he came back from something, checking on her first before anything else. He had done this since he was very small, and she had never fully known what to do with how much it moved her. He said nothing. He walked to her and stood beside her. She put her arm around his shoulders. He leaned against her, just slightly, the way he sometimes still did, even though he was 12, and recently pointed out to her that he was nearly a teenager, and teenagers did not lean on their mothers in hallways. She held him there for a moment. Then Priya appeared in the doorway, red-eyed but composed, asking whether they would please stay a little longer, because Mrs. Whitfield wanted to speak with both of them. The conference room had changed in the minutes since Marcus walked out of it. Some of the people had been excused, the overseas investors had gone quietly, the lawyers had been asked to step to a side room. What remained was a smaller, closer group: Dr. Fenton, Dr. Saran, Priya, and 3 of Mrs. Whitfield's most senior executives, people who had worked alongside her long enough to understand that what they had witnessed was not to be treated carelessly or spoken about in ways that reduced it. Mrs. Whitfield was standing when Diane and Marcus came back in. Standing, which was itself a statement. An hour ago, standing required an effort she had been masking from everyone. Now she stood straight at the head of the table, and the straightness was not performance. It was simply what her body was doing. She looked at Diane first. "You are her mother." "Yes," Diane said, simply, without adding or diminishing. "He told me about your grandmother, your mother." "Yes, ma'am." "She taught him this?" "She taught him many things," Diane said, but she would have said she mostly helped him see what was already in him. Mrs. Whitfield nodded. She looked at Marcus. "You said you want to study, to learn from books you cannot afford and from people you cannot reach." "Yes, ma'am." "I would like to help you with that." She paused, choosing her next words with the care of someone for whom words had always been instruments of precision. "Not as payment, not as a transaction between us, as a continuation of what your grandmother started." Diane held herself very still. She was a woman who had learned over 11 years of working in buildings like this one that the word help coming from that direction and offered without conditions stated up front required careful definition. "What does that mean exactly?" she asked. Mrs. Whitfield respected the directness of the question and answered it in full detail. She described an educational fund she controlled that had been largely dormant for years, originally created to support young people in medical and healing disciplines who would not otherwise have any path to them.
She described her connections to 3 universities and 2 research institutions. She described a network of integrative medicine practitioners she had funded quietly for years, people working at the boundary between formal clinical medicine and traditional healing knowledge. She said she would like to direct those resources specifically towards Marcus, his education, whatever form that took, the books, the mentors, the time and access, whatever he needed to follow this as far as it could be followed. She said it without conditions, without requiring gratitude or acknowledgement, the way someone gives directions to a place they know well. Diane looked at Marcus. He was listening with his full attention, his face still. "What did your grandmother's handwriting look like?" Mrs. Whitfield asked, turning to Marcus unexpectedly. He blinked at the question. He said it was small and very neat, that she wrote in columns sometimes, arranged like a table when she was comparing different observations or ideas. "She sounds like a scientist," Mrs. Whitfield said. She was. She just never got to be called one. The room was quiet for a moment, the full kind. Mrs. Whitfield walked to the end of the table. She stopped in front of Marcus. She looked at him directly, eye to eye, this small woman and this 12-year-old boy. Then she thanked him. She said his name, and she thanked him, simply and truly. He nodded. And then she did something that no one in that room had ever seen Margaret Whitfield do in all the years they had known her. She knelt, right there on the polished floor of the conference room she owned. She lowered herself to one knee with the slow, careful movements of a 74-year-old woman whose mourning had been difficult. She knelt until she was level with him, until she was looking at him eye to eye. "Your grandmother would be proud," she said. It was the right thing to say, the truest thing said in that room all day. It landed in Marcus precisely where things land when they are entirely true. His eyes were bright. He kept his face steady. He breathed. "Thank you. I believe she would."
They left the building an hour later, Marcus and his mother, slipping out through the service entrance on the ground floor because Diane still had 2 offices to finish, and the building supervisor did not know she had spent time standing in hallways on 43 while her son was changing both their lives. The city was doing what cities do on a Tuesday afternoon in October. Moving, consuming, going about the enormous and invisible business of itself. Taxis and delivery trucks, people walking fast with phones in their hands, the smell of coffee from a cart near the corner, a dog pulling its owner impatiently toward a tree, the ordinary world completely unaware. Marcus walked beside his mother. He had his backpack over his right shoulder again, the same safety pin, the same worn strap. In the front zipper pocket, the one where he kept things he wanted to keep safe, he was carrying a cream-colored card with a direct phone number on it in small print. Priya had told him quietly, when she gave it to him, that Mrs. Whitfield gave out that number to approximately no one. His mother walked and did not speak. She was processing everything. He understood this about her and gave her the space to do it. After 2 blocks, she said, "I should have listened more carefully when your grandmother was teaching you." "You listened," he said. "I thought it was stories, old woman knowledge. I did not understand that she was preparing you for something real." "She was preparing me for everything," Marcus said. "I think that is different." Diane stopped walking. She looked at his son in the October light, low and golden, the particular amber quality that afternoon in the South takes on in autumn. She saw in his face, for just a moment, in just one angle of the light, her mother's face, the same quiet, the same settled certainty that was not arrogance, the same presence that made people stop what they were doing and pay attention. She started walking again before he could see that she was about to cry for the 4th time that day. "We are having chicken tonight," she said. "With the rice?" he asked. "With the rice." "Good," he said. They walked home through the ordinary city that did not know what it had missed. The world mostly did not hear about what had happened on the 43rd floor on that Tuesday in October. Mrs. Whitfield did not call a press conference. She did not post anything. She gave no interviews, though two journalists who had been in adjacent rooms that day and had heard pieces of the story through walls and through other people's conversations came to her office and asked. She declined them both, politely and finally. She said nothing publicly, but she moved. She moved the way powerful people move when they have genuinely changed their minds about something, not with announcement, not with ceremony, but with the steady, structural adjustment of someone rerouting where things go. She had long conversations with her medical advisory board. She met at length with the leadership of her foundation. She called 3 integrative medicine practitioners she had been funding for years, but had never met in person. She told each of them essentially the same thing, that she had recently had an experience which brought her back to the original reasons she had started funding their work, that she was going to be increasing their operating resources and removing several restrictions on how those resources could be used, that she was especially interested in the question of training, specifically in identifying young people who had real hands-on healing gifts and building them pathways into formal education alongside practitioners who still worked directly with bodies and still trusted what their hands could find. She did not use Marcus's name in any of these conversations. She had promised Diane that she would not. Diane had asked for this specific thing as one of her conditions before they left the building. She had said, "He is 12 years old. He needs to be 12 for a while longer before he becomes anyone's story." Mrs. Whitfield had honored this completely and without reservation. What she did instead was build the structure first, the scholarship framework, the mentorship arrangements, a curriculum that held both formal and traditional knowledge in equal seriousness, that made room for the clinical and the embodied, the measurable and the felt. She built it from Marcus at its core, but she built it wide enough that it would carry others too. Rose Carter's knowledge, the knowledge that lived in a small house and in 15 spiral notebooks and in the hands of one boy, deserved more than a single path forward. Dr. Sarin called Mrs. Whitfield 2 weeks after the conference room. She had been thinking. She had done research. She had found 3 documented clinical cases in the medical literature whose presentation matched what Marcus had described and what she had subsequently witnessed, and she was drafting a paper. She wanted to know if Marcus could come and talk with her. Just talk, she said, quickly, not as a subject or a patient, but as someone whose observations she was genuinely curious about. Mrs. Whitfield said she would ask. She called Diane. Diane asked Marcus. Marcus said yes. He asked if he could bring his grandmother's notebook, the blue one. Dr. Sarin said of course he could. They met on a Saturday morning in a small office at the University Medical Center. Dr. Sarin had printed out the 3 case studies and spread them on her desk. Marcus had his notebook. They talked for 3 hours. At one point, Dr. Sarin set down her pen and simply listened while Marcus read passages from Rose's notes aloud, and her expression was the expression people get when they hear something they had been thinking about in one language suddenly said to them clearly in their own. Your grandmother was documenting this systematically. She was building a methodology. She called it listening work, Marcus said. I would like to call it something we study properly, Dr. Sarin said. This was the beginning of something. Marcus would not know how large that beginning was.
6 months after the day in the tower, a small storefront at the corner of Delmar Street and Vine Hill Road was repainted. It had stood empty for 2 years, a former pharmacy whose owner had retired and whose family had not found a buyer. The windows had been papered over.
The sign above the door had faded to almost nothing. Now the paper came down from the windows. New glass went in. The interior was renovated quietly over 3 weeks by a small crew who worked efficiently and without drawing attention. A new sign was installed above the door. It read, "The Rose Carter Wellness Center, Community Health and Integrative Practice." Mrs. Whitfield had asked Diane what the center should be called. Diane had been quiet for a long moment, long enough that Mrs. Whitfield thought she might have asked too much. Then Diane had said her mother's name. The center opened on a Wednesday morning in April. There was no ribbon cutting, no photographers, no press release sent anywhere. The door was simply unlocked and the lights were on and the sign was in the window. By noon, 4 people from the neighborhood had walked in. The staff was small, a physician 2 days a week, a nurse practitioner 3 days, and 3 community health workers who had been trained through a program designed jointly by Dr. Saran, Mrs. Whitfield's foundation, and Marcus, who had spent 2 Saturdays talking through what he believed the program should look like and what his grandmother would have wanted it to hold. The approach had no grand title. It was described simply as thorough. We take our time, we listen, we look at the whole picture. We do not rush you out the door. The neighborhood understood what the center was before they had been inside it. They knew because they had watched the building come back to life. They knew because someone's neighbor had come in with a knee that had been hurting for 2 years and left saying, "They actually listened to me." The whole situation, not just the knee. They knew because of the name on the window and because many people in Vine Hill had known Rose Carter, had sat in her kitchen or her front room, had walked away from those visits feeling more like themselves. For those people, seeing her name on a door was something that required a moment to stand still in. One afternoon, a woman in her 80s named Miss Gladys came in from 2 streets over. She had lived near Rose for more than 40 years. She stood in the waiting room and looked at the center's name on the wall and was very quiet for a moment. The young woman at the front desk asked if she could help her with anything. "I just wanted to see it," Miss Gladys said. "I wanted to see her name on a building." She stayed for a few minutes and then she left. The young woman at the desk, who was 23 and had not known Rose Carter personally, found herself crying without fully understanding why. She had never experienced the particular sensation before of being moved by the honoring of someone she had never met. She understood sitting there that this was the right kind of room to feel it in. Marcus came to the center after school twice a week. He sat in on patient appointments when people agreed to it, listening with the same focused quiet his grandmother had trained him into, continuing to learn, adding to his vocabulary of both the formal and the felt. He was also enrolled in an accelerated university program, attending 2 evenings a week for courses in anatomy and physiology and neuroscience, alongside medical students who were twice his age and who learned often in the first 10 minutes of sitting near him to stop underestimating him. He still had the blue notebook in his backpack. He added to it steadily now, his own observations in his own handwriting, a bit smaller than Rose's, in a different colored pen, but arranged in the same careful columns she had taught him to use. He had started a second notebook. He expected to need a third before the year was out. He was building a conversation with his grandmother in the margins of everything she had left behind. It was the best and most honest way he had found to keep talking to her. There was a board meeting in November, the annual one, at which Mrs. Whitfield typically presented the year's financial performance and set the strategic direction for the following year. 17 members attended. They were all accomplished and experienced, all entirely accustomed to the rhythm of these meetings. Prepared presentations, measured language, the careful translation of all things into charts and projections in language that fit inside the categories a major organization uses to understand itself. Mrs. Whitfield opened the meeting as she always did, promptly, without preamble, with the agenda displayed at the front of the room. But before she moved to the first item, she stopped. She said that before they began the formal agenda, she wanted to tell them something that happened to her in October. It was not on the agenda. It was not quantifiable. She was telling it to them anyway because she believed it was more important than most of what was on the agenda, and because she had spent her entire career believing that the most important things are usually the ones that resist being put on a slide. The room was attentive in the way of people who were surprised but trained not to show surprise. She told them the whole story, the pain in the room, in the joke about $10 million, the boy in the doorway, what he had seen that 4 specialists had not seen, what he had done in less than a minute with his hands, what he had said about his grandmother and about healing and about why he would not accept money for what he had done. She told them about the notebook, about the conversation with Dr. Saran, about the center on Delmar Street and the name above its door. And then she said, "I have run this organization for 31 years by learning to recognize value before it announces itself, by seeing something in a person or a situation that others had not yet identified and moving accordingly. That is, I have always been told, the defining skill of what I do." A pause. "I failed to exercise that skill for an entire category of knowledge, for an entire category of people. I funded innovation, I funded disruption, I funded the next thing and the newer thing, and I walked past the kind of knowledge that has existed in our communities since long before this building was built, in the hands and notebooks of women who cleaned offices and raised children and healed their neighbors and were never once in their lives called scientists. I did not fund that. I did not look for it. I am correcting this now." She looked at the table. "I am telling you this because I want you to understand what we are doing and why, and because in 31 years, this is one of 4 occasions on which I have said in this room that I was wrong about something. I recommend you note it." Several members of the board, people who had known her for a decade or more, found they needed a moment. She moved to the first agenda item. The meeting continued, but something was different after. It was difficult to say exactly what. The meeting felt more honest, more grounded, like a room that had been opened to outside air.
Marcus was still 12. Then he was 13. The world did not reorganize itself around him, because the world does not do that. He still went to school every day in the same building, with the same friends and the same kids who were not friends. He still lived on the same street with his mother in the same apartment, where the heat came on too strong in winter and sometimes not enough in the months between seasons. His mother had reduced her working hours, something arranged quietly through Priya, who had carried a message from Mrs. Whitfield to Diane, offering to modify her employment arrangement however she needed. Diane had taken 2 nights off per week. She used those nights to sleep. This seemed like a small thing from the outside. It was not a small thing. It was the first time in 8 years that Diane Carter slept more than 5 hours in a row on a regular basis. The effect on her health, on the quality of light in her face, on her voice when she called to Marcus from across the apartment, was not a small thing. Marcus noticed it every day and said nothing about it, because he understood, in the way he understood most important things, that she would not want him to name it. He thought of his grandmother every day. He thought of her in the center on Delmar Street, watching a health worker listen to a patient with the full, unhurried attention the center was built around. He thought of her in the university classroom, when a professor described a mechanism he had already seen described in Rose's handwriting, only in different words. He thought of her on the bus sometimes, for no particular reason except that she was always there, the way the people we have truly lost are always there. He thought of her on the evening he passed the corner of Peachtree Grand Boulevard on his way home from the university and looked up at the glass tower rising against the dark October sky 1 year after the first October and saw the 43rd floor indistinguishable from every other floor, light and glass, and nothing visible from the street, and thought about an old woman in a dark navy suit kneeling on a polished floor and saying, "Your grandmother would be proud." He thought she would. He thought,
I am trying to be worthy of it. Every day. He got off the bus at his stop. He walked home. He sat at the kitchen table and opened the second notebook, not the blue one tonight, but the newer one, and he wrote down what he had noticed in the center that afternoon, in the careful columns Rose had taught him, adding one more page to a conversation that was still going. It is easy to tell a story like this one and make it about money, about a poor family and a rich woman and the transaction between them, however unusual, that moves resources from one side to the other. It is easy to make it about surprise in reversal, about the powerful person humbled and the powerless person elevated, and to leave it there, satisfied with the neatness of the inversion. This is not quite that story. Or it contains that story, but underneath it is something older and quieter and less easily resolved. It is a story about knowledge, specifically about whose knowledge the world decides to count. Rose Carter was never educated in any institution. She received no degree, she published nothing, she gave no lectures, and received no awards. Her name appeared on nothing. Not a building, not a plaque, not a paper, not a certificate. She spent her life in the spaces that the world considers invisible. The early morning office, the neighbor's kitchen, the small room smelling of herbs and clean soap. She helped hundreds of people. We do not know the number because no one counted. No one counted because no one was watching. And no one was watching because the world had already decided that what happened in rooms like hers did not count as the kind of thing worth watching. The world has always been full of Rose Carters, women and men who carry accumulated knowledge in their hands and their careful observations, knowledge developed over generations and tested in the daily reality of people's bodies and lives, knowledge that persists and is transmitted not through institutions, but through the specific intimacy of a grandmother with her grandchild, a parent with a child, an elder with someone young who truly pays attention and lets it in. This knowledge has always been undervalued, sometimes dismissed entirely, sometimes taken, repackaged with a new name and an institution's logo, and sold back to the communities it originally came from at a price they could not pay. This is not ancient history. It is a continuing and present fact. What Marcus carried into that conference room was not only his own skill. He carried Rose. He carried the women before Rose, whose names he did not know, but whose methods had reached him anyway through a chain of transmission that had refused to be broken regardless of how many things tried to break it. What the room witnessed was not a miracle. Miracles are outside the ordinary order of things. This was inside it. This was a 12-year-old boy applying knowledge that existed and worked and always existed and worked. The extraordinary part was not the healing. The extraordinary part was that the room was forced in this particular moment to witness it. And in witnessing it, it was forced to reckon with what it had been choosing not to see. This is what silent strength truly means. Not the strength of silence as submission or suppression. Not the strength of someone made small by a world that cannot see them, forced to swallow their gifts and carry on. That is not strength. That is survival, which demands its own hard respect, but must not be mistaken for power. Silent strength is something else. It is the strength of a person who knows what they know and does not require anyone's permission to know it, who does not need a label or a credential or an audience to keep doing the work they were made to do, who is not diminished by laughter because the laughter has nothing to do with the truth of what they carry. It is the strength of Rose Carter in a small house on Delmar Street, filling notebooks the world called nothing, healing people the world called anecdote, teaching a grandchild the world would one day call remarkable, without ever once requiring the world to call her anything at all. It is the strength of Marcus, standing in a room full of laughter with his hands still and his face quiet, and his grandmother's knowledge whole and alive and ready inside him, waiting for the moment to do what it had always been able to do. Waiting. Not diminished by the waiting, just waiting.
Marcus Carter graduated from medical school at 26. The specialty he chose, after years of moving between disciplines, between formal clinical medicine and traditional healing practice, between the institution and the notebook, did not yet have a clean, established name. He was working on that. He considered the naming of it part of the work. His doctoral dissertation was a study of what he called embodied diagnostic methods, the systematic and trainable skill of reading the body's condition through direct observation and careful touch. It drew on his grandmother's notebooks, which had been formally digitized and archived by the University Medical Library, and on his own 15 years of documented practice, and on the work of Dr. Saran and 4 other researchers who had followed the thread he had helped them see. The dissertation was peer-reviewed. It was published. Within 2 years, it had been cited by 47 other research papers and had been read, if the download numbers meant anything, by people in countries he had never visited. It was the foundation of a field that did not yet fully exist and that he intended to spend his career helping to build. His mother came to his graduation. She had bought her dress 3 months in advance, which was not like her. She was not a person who bought things early as a rule, planning being something she associated with having more certainty about the future than she trusted. But for this, she had wanted to be ready ahead of time. She sat in the second row because the front row had been offered to family members of honorees, and she had told the usher she preferred not to be in the very front, where she would have to worry about her face, which she could not always govern when things mattered enormously. Marcus crossed the stage. He received his degree with both hands. He looked for his mother in the crowd and found her in the second row, and her face was doing exactly what she had been afraid it would do, which was everything at once. She was not trying to hide it. He had never seen her not try to hide it before. He held the degree up and pointed at the sky. It was something they had started doing when he was 9 years old, pointing upward as a way of directing something toward someone who was no longer standing beside them, a way of saying, "This belongs to you, too." He did not know if she could see it clearly from the second row. She could. She pressed one hand against her mouth and pointed back at him with the other. The Rose Carter Wellness Center on Delmar Street had, by this point, served over 14,000 patients. It had expanded twice, taking over 2 neighboring storefronts and adding a second floor. It had trained 53 community health workers using the curriculum Marcus and Dr. Saran and Mrs. Whitfield's foundation had developed together across many Saturday morning meetings. It had become a model for 4 similar centers in other cities, each named for a local healer whose knowledge had never previously been honored with a building or a plaque or a name on a wall. Mrs. Whitfield attended the graduation. Marcus had not known she would be there. She arrived quietly with Priya and sat near the back of the hall. He saw her afterward in the crowd of families milling about in the spring sunshine. She looked older than when he had last seen her, but she moved well. She moved like someone whose body was freed from something a long time ago and had not forgotten that freedom. She shook his hand. She had always had a particular handshake, firm, brief, completely honest. "Your grandmother would be proud," she said. She had said this to him once before, a long time ago, kneeling on a polished floor. She said it again now. It was just as true the second time. "I know," he said. "I carry that." She nodded. She did not linger. She turned and walked back through the crowd with Priya beside her and was gone quietly, the way she had come, before most people present had noticed she was there. Marcus stood with his mother in the May afternoon light.
He had his degree in one hand and his backpack over his right shoulder, the same backpack, a new safety pin on the left strap where the old one had finally given out. His grandmother's blue notebook was inside it, as it had been years, as it would always be. His mother had her arm around him. He leaned against her just as slightly, the way he sometimes still did. She held him there. Neither of them spoke for a long time. They did not need to. Some things that are true do not need to be said. They need only to be stood in, to be felt at their full weight, to be allowed to be exactly what they are, which is enough, which is more than enough, which, on the right afternoon in the right light with the right person beside you, is everything.